After weeks of dithering following the outbreak of war, the Assembly Parliament had finally capitulated to Prime Minister Benedict Forrest's insistence on a large-scale counterattack into Union space, intended largely to win back public opinion with a show of strength and in the hope of intimidating the Union into abandoning their war effort. The plan was staunchly opposed by Fleet Admiral Darius Farron, the recently appointed Commander-in-Chief of the CDF, and by several other significant voices in Admiralty House, as a foolish risk that was clearly being considered more for political reasons than strategic ones. Farron, however, found himself drowned out by other leading members of the Admiralty, and by many of his fellow Grey Hat MPs, including Secretary of State for Defence Vinya Aliaputra. Though he gave in to these pressures without too much complaint at the time, years later Farron would publicly state his view that his colleagues who backed this attack did so solely to curry favour with the Prime Minister, an opinion backed up by the fact that several of those who supported Forrest were suspiciously awarded various social honours or budgetary increases to their constituencies in the wake of giving their support. It had taken weeks for a specific target to be finally selected for this counterattack, and ultimately it was decided that the objective of the incursion would be to lay siege to the large Union shipbuilding facility of Sojourn Wharf in the Dalstaff system, their second largest shipbuilding facility after the famous Cadarin Dorai. As the large force was assembled at Axios's ancient Fort Weaver, under the command of Vice Admiral Delilah Morette, news arrived of the recent action of Equinox 57th, fought by the CSV Vanquisher against a new kind of Union frigate, and the resulting intelligence that Mauritian arms sales may in fact be turning the Union militia into a far more dangerous foe than they were being frequently taken for. Some in the Assembly Parliament, particularly on the modernist benches, attempted to counsel restraint in the wake of this news until further intelligence could be gathered, or to divert further resources to the neglected and important southwestern front, but the Prime Minister insisted the counterattack would proceed as planned. Departing from Fort Weaver at 12 bells noon, on the 61st of Equinox 291 PCU, Division Morette, comprising a large fraction of Force East and elements on detachment from the diminutive Force Southeast, laid in a course for the Axios Atara Gate. Their departure from the fort was watched across the Assembly as a spectacle unseen in many decades. A huge portion of the total strength of the Central Defence Force, including much of the fleet's ships of the line, deployed in unison. The fleet was divided into 4 squadrons, 3 of which were powerful formations of heavy units arranged in line of battle. Squadron Morette, the flag squadron, took up the vanguard at the lead of Morette's flagship, the Dawnspring, and arranged behind them were the 2 pennant squadrons, Squadron Lyndhurst under Commodore Garibald Lyndhurst, and Squadron Abeno under Commodore Haru Abeno. At the far aft, commanding the baggage train and a smaller quick response force, was Senior Post Captain Jaden Ruthridge, formerly of the CSV Sapphire, having only been a free man for a short few days, following his ransoming back to the Assembly after his capture in the Battle of Atticus. After a long 11-day burn across the huge expanse of the Axios system, Division Morette made its transit into the comparatively tiny Atara system. With gate lanes having been disabled across belligerent borders, the fleet travelled via single-gate transit, and as such was scattered upon arrival. 2 ships from Squadron Lyndhurst, the Sarnfarrow and Andalay, were unlucky in the placement of their arrival, and immediately ran afoul of a large Paleborn patrol, quickly resulting in the Andalay's destruction and the brutal capture of the Sarnfarrow. The rest of the division had better fortunes, and their transits were made without incident. The subsequent reconsolidation was also completed without issue, and the reorganised force secured the Atara Axios Driftgate without action, as its few defenders withdrew at the sight of the approaching CDF force, and the gate crew surrendered. With their escape route secured, Morette ordered Squadron Ruthridge to remain in position to defend the gate and the baggage train, while taking the rest of the force onward to carry out the plan laid down by Forrest's cabinet and his supporters in the Admiralty. As the impenetrable interference of the Howling made it impossible to accurately determine the size or disposition of Paleborn forces in Atara, the CDF would rely on simply concentrating a force larger than even their most generous estimates of Paleborn strength, such that they could not safely engage it. To actually scour the Atara crossroads of pirates and destroy Abaskal's force would be the work of years in such a hostile environment. So instead, the CDF planned to create and hold a secure corridor of space by which forces sieging Sojourn Wharf could be kept supplied and given an avenue of withdrawal. The task of holding this corridor fell to the now slightly weakened Squadron Lyndhurst, and as such it was known as the Lyndhurst Salient. Supported by Squadron Ruthridge's QRF vessels, Lyndhurst and his ships escorted Squadrons Morette and Abeno in their push onwards to secure the Atara Dalstaff Gate, while themselves holding the edges of the forming salient to protect against flanking attacks. regularly leaving behind small detachments, spaced to allow at least one vessel to be in theoretical intercept range of any attack from the inner system. In an unexpected development, no full-scale attack came for the full length of their slow journey across the system, though many small raiding attacks conducted at long range kept the CDF force distracted through the night and drained much of their ammunition. At one point, a large massed Paleborn squadron launched a feint on Commodore Lyndhurst's immediate formation, which, to his credit, he was wise enough to ignore and maintain cohesion, not allowing himself to be led deeper into the system and surrounded. Unbeknownst to the CDF, Arcelia Abascal, to her increasing rage, had once again been ordered to hold back from full engagement, with Kaito Hakim not yet wishing to risk too much of Abascal's forces. The battle-hungry Abascal was assured by Hakim that within a few short hours, she would have her chance for plunder and destruction. This would be the last message sent from Hakim to Abascal before Centran forces were too close to the Atara Dalstaff gate for message couriers to be sent through. At 10 bells and a half glass that morning, the combined units of Squadron Morette and Squadron Abeno seized control of the Atara Dalstaff driftgate, again without action. As Atara and Dalstaff were connected by a properly aligned driftgate, a direct transit which emerged through the Dalstaff gate itself was possible. Squadron Morette made their transit first as the vanguard, and as the CDF squadron completed its transit, the gate's small Union garrison force fell back, adhering to the Third Amendment of the Corrida Concordance, forbidding close action within effective firing range of an active driftgate. With the gate now under CDF control, Morette surveyed her surroundings. The fleeing garrison was consolidating with a nearby squadron of 8 Union outriders under the command of Captain Tazami Dejeshu, and so far no other Union squadron was in sight, only the standing garrison of the system's various installations, including Senjin Wharf itself. Anticipating a long siege of the wharf facility, and now drained of ammunition by the many raiding attacks, Morette sent word to Squadron Ruthridge for elements of the baggage train to be sent to the front to resupply the vanguard, but did not wait either for them or for Squadron Abeno to finish transiting their full force. Not wishing to allow Captain Dejeshu's Outrider squadron to consolidate with the wharf's garrison before she could lay siege, Morette split her forces, leaving Squadron Abeno to guard the gate, and set off immediately with her own squadron to begin the siege. By the time she had set up siege positions around the wharf, just outside of the effective firing range of its defense satellites, Admiral Morette was convinced that almost the entirety of the Frontier Union's fighting strength must have been committed to their southwestern invasion, and that little remained in Union space to challenge her. However, her rush to begin the siege had prevented a new salient from being created between the gate and her siege position, leaving her own squadron and Squadron Abeno to hold their separated positions. As Captain Dejeshu's Outriders, now reinforced by various cutters and gunboats drawn from other in-system garrisons, maintained constant marauding in the space between to ensure the last link in the supply chain could not be filled in. It had been calculated that under current famine conditions, it would take approximately 24 days of siege to exhaust the wharf's supplies, though it was the opinion of the Prime Minister and his advisors that a surrender would be secured much more quickly than that, an assumption rooted in a serious underestimation of the Union's commitment to total war. On each of the first 5 days of the siege, Dejeshu's Outrider squadron broke from their marauding for an hour or so in the evening to launch feints against Squadron Morette, goading them into abandoning their siege positions and engaging. 4 times they swept within meters of the Admiral's force, taunting them over an open channel before returning to their separation of the 2 Centran squadrons. Morette grew increasingly concerned that her supply ships could not make it to the vanguard, and that she may not be able to maintain the siege under these conditions. On Dejeshu's 5th feint, still convinced this small squadron of Outriders was all that opposed her, Admiral Morette finally gave in, and broke her squadron from their siege positions to pursue and destroy the Outriders. What followed is known to this day as the Battle of the 5 Feints, leading Morette high off the ecliptic into deep space before turning to begin hit-and-run attacks. Characteristic Union tactics and use of the famous Rangomu lockstep allowed this small force to inflict serious casualties and drag the action on long into the night. Morette was able to destroy 2 Union vessels despite taking losses of her own. Within a few hours of this long stern chase, the true cost of this mistake would become apparent. At 4 bells and 12 minutes in the afternoon, a heat signature was detected, emerging from behind the small moon of Nocturne. Before long, telescopy revealed it to be a Union squadron. Among its ranks more than a dozen Outriders, backed by powerful Mauritian gunships, and at its head, 3 of the Union's new Alessia-class vessels. Aboard the class leader, Alessia, Kaito Hakim himself commanded the fleet, where he had laid in wait for almost a week, for the Assembly to make their fatal mistake. With all thought of the siege forgotten, it was immediately apparent to Morette that Hakim's newly appeared force, with its high-speed craft, was in a position to cut her squadron off from Squadron Urbano, but there was little she could do to stop it. Stretched into a long column, the militia force drove a wedge between the two squadrons, hemming Squadron Urbano against the drift gate, before splitting into a forked double envelopment around Morette's forces. Though the shadow of Sen'jin Wharf could be seen cast against the ice planet Refuge in the Dawnspring scopes, Morette would never return to her target. Despite being essentially a passenger aboard the Alessia, with no real naval combat experience of his own, Hakim had learned valuable lessons from the reports sent from the Battle of Atticus. He knew that the powerful hit-and-run tactics of his militia vessels could inflict deadly damage and force a retreat, but that once a CDF force was in retreat, with their powerful inertial dampening technology, it was nearly impossible for his own ships to catch them. Thus he needed to draw his enemy into overstretching themselves, such that he could surround them and leave no avenue of escape. Circling in a closing noose around Morette's stilted line of battle, Hakim sent wave after wave of alternating hit-and-run attacks to which the Admiral could not coordinate an adequate defence. As ships started to panic and break, some striking their colours, the squadron's cohesion was lost, and despite facing what should have been an inferior force, Squadron Morette was gradually overcome. Meanwhile, Hakim and the rest of his attack group, choosing not to show the same respect for the rules of engagement that his countrymen had earlier, unhesitatingly leapt to attack Squadron Urbano in close proximity to the driftgate. Squadron Urbano itself was already in a state of confusion, unsure whether to attempt to resume the siege or move to assist Squadron Morette, and rushing to send couriers to keep their forces in Atamara appraised of the situation. A hastily assembled plan to rescue Morette's force was about to be launched when Hakim's ships suddenly fell upon them. At this time, Admiral Morette aboard the Dawnspring was still in reliable communication with Squadron Urbano, albeit with extensive light lag, and remained in overall command. It was she who had ordered an attempt to rescue her and her squadron from their predicament, though Commodore Urbano was hesitant to allow more of their forces to become surrounded and cut off. In an attempt to find a sort of compromise solution that might not strictly be considered insubordination, Urbano informed Morette that he would pull his force back into Atamara to reconsolidate before relaunching a more organised attack. The chaos would only build, however, as Urbano's withdrawal was interrupted by the emergence of the oblivious CDF baggage train through the Atamara Dalstaff gate on their latest resupply run, forcing a large pile-up and significant delay to the squadron's attempts to transit in the other direction. All the while, this chaotic mess of Centran ships continued to be hammered with railgun and torpedo fire from all sides, taking heavy losses. Once Commodore Urbano finally reorganised enough of his ships to properly withdraw from the system, he hailed the Dawnspring to request a final update of her position, but this time received no response. The flagship had dropped out of contact 5 minutes earlier and no longer appeared on LiDAR. After a short time, closer telescopy revealed that she had been destroyed. Now officially in command of the expedition, and seeing no safe opportunity to recover the doomed remnants of Squadron Morette, Urbano ordered a full retreat. What followed was a long and grim stern chase across the Atamara crossroads, now known as the Battle of the Lyndhurst Salient. Fleeing across the system towards the Axios Gate, pursued by Hakim's force, Squadron Urbano slowly consolidated with Squadron Lyndhurst as they went. Once more, Arcelia Abascal requested permission to fall upon the fleeing squadrons from the inner system, crushing them between her own and Hakim's forces. But betraying his earlier promise, Hakim denied her, intending to drive the Centran route himself. Abascal was apparently incensed by this, to the point that Hakim felt it was necessary that she be given at least some small appeasement, so by his order, she was permitted to attack the small Squadron Ruthridge, positioned at the Atamara Axios Gate. With a huge force of ships assembled behind her own Wicked Witch, Abascal bore down on the small squadron at great speed, and Captain Jaden Ruthridge was faced with a difficult decision. He could use this time to withdraw his own squadron safely into Axios, he could hold his ground at the gate, where his force would undoubtedly be destroyed, and the Paleborn would then be positioned to inflict further damage to Squadrons Urbano and Lyndhurst once they reached the gate themselves, or he could lead the Paleborn on a brief and doomed chase off the Ecliptic, to buy the other squadrons a window of opportunity to escape. He chose this option, pushing to a high-G burn with the many pirates in pursuit, until he saw that the haggard rest of the fleet had made it to the Axios system safely. With nowhere left to run and no chance of winning if he turned to fight, Ruthridge then ordered his entire squadron to strike their colours. With no Devin Tandil to ensure fair treatment this time, his fate would be quite different. Neither he nor any of the more than 500 service people of Squadron Ruthridge were ever seen or heard from again. The Dalstaff campaign was an unmitigated disaster for the CDF, and is cited by many historians as the lowest point of the entire war for the Assembly. A huge fraction of the entire Centran defence force was lost to capture or destruction, including most of the currently serving ships of the line. In private, Prime Minister Benedict Forrest seemed to recognise the vastness of his mistake, and began to more closely heed the counsel of Fleet Admiral Darius Farron for the rest of the war, but in public he refused to admit any wrongdoing, and insisted that the squadron commanders on the scene were entirely to blame for this failure. Haru Abeno, in particular, was made the target of vicious condemnation by Forrest and his cabinet, who they publicly accused of cowardice for his choice to quit the field rather than attempt to rescue his admiral. At the insistence of the Prime Minister, Abeno was stripped of the Order of Whitecourt and demoted to the rank of Staff Captain. The most significant revelation of the failed campaign was the true extent to which the Mauritian Freehold had been supporting the Union war effort. While the Union's own shipbuilding infrastructure was limited, one thing they did have in abundance was extremely valuable coolant gases and fusion fuels, mined from the rich gas giants of Teldrin. The great wealth of the Teldrin system, and the Freehold's neutrality, had essentially allowed them to buy anything they needed, outsourcing much of their entire war machine to the Mauritians. The Centrum Assembly, however, in an ironic turnaround, were no longer in a position to condemn or attempt to shut down the Mauritians' arms trading and shipbuilding support, as having just lost a huge portion of their navy, they were now in need of it themselves. As orders were being placed for huge shipments of building materials and ordnance from Mauritia to support the new wave of replacement CDF warships, the Assembly Parliament, Union Council and Freehold Directorate were forced by circumstance to negotiate what would become known as the Treaty of Mizudori. Signed in orbit of the huge gas giant, which provided so much of the Teldrin system's wealth, the Treaty of Mizudori codified the total neutrality of the Mauritian Freehold, and gave them full permission to offer their services and supplies to both belligerent nations at the same prices, a practice that would continue for the entire war, generating gargantuan amounts of revenue for the Mauritian Freehold from the safety of their untouched solar systems. Thank you for watching. You can get the Sojourn through various distributors, all of which are accessible through www.thesojournaudiodrama.com. You can also get the series through Patreon, where you'll be able to access various bonus features, including our visual dictionary, Guinevere cross-sections, and anthology shorts. Remember to join us on Discord and get regular updates on all upcoming Sojourn releases. All the related links can be found below this video. Fair winds.